So, there's a lot going on. I'm going to try to recap some of it quickly. You guys can fill in the holes, but a federal judge on Sunday night blocked the Trump administration from deploying any out of state National Guard troops to the state of Oregon. State of Illinois and the city of Chicago have both sued to block what Governor Pritzker calls a, quote, Trump invasion of the city. And Mayor Brandon Johnson signed an executive order today that says that city property, including parking lots, cannot be used as staging grounds for raids by ICE agents. Caroline Levitt said this about all of this today at the White House briefing. She said, quote, the president has the right to call up the National Guard in cases where he deems it appropriate. And she went on to say, we're confident in the president's legal authority to do this, and we're very confident we will win on the merits of the law. Richard, let's start with the law. We have this lawsuit. We have executive orders. Who knows what else? Which of these has the best chance of stopping Trump, or is he right that the administration will eventually prevail?
You should probably point out, Andy, that while we talk about the law in this program, none of us are lawyers. Richard actually is a lawyer and has been a lawyer for like 4 decades, so he knows what he's talking about.
Right. So that's why we're glad to have him on for this segment. So, Richard, what do you say?
Well, look, I mean, I think that it depends on the facts and circumstances on the ground. And what that is in Chicago is the Chicago Police Department is refusing to, at the directive of the mayor, refusing to protect federal agents and federal property. And over the course of the weekend, we saw what I think are fairly called riots. They weren't peaceful protests. It was people throwing rocks, bricks, destroying a property, hitting cars, obstructing cars. We actually had a situation where agents were boxed in by 10 cars, and they refused. The CPD refused to respond. And there's now evidence that they were commanded not to respond. At the head of the watch was doing that, and I think it's believed that the order came from City Hall. If the local police will not protect the personnel and property of the federal government, the president, of course, is going to have the right to bring in additional forces, including National Guard, in order to protect those personnel and that property. I mean, it's not a hard thing to see. And, there are some district judges. There are 677 district judges out there. And among those, you're going to find many who are very virulently anti-Trump. Not a surprise. There have been dozens of district court injunctions and dozens overturned by appellate courts. So look, the Trump administration is working through the court system, getting the authorization it needs when they're being sued. But I think we have to recognize that what's going on in Chicago is very weird and very, very odd. We had the mayor today basically saying that city properties were off limits to federal agents. So what are they going to do? Are they going to say it's trespass if a federal agent goes into a parking lot? Are they going to send the Chicago police to arrest the federal officer for trespass? And they're discussing the activities of the federal government in terms of the ICE agents and the Border Patrol as a quote unquote invasion, as if Illinois isn't part of the United States. It's nuts. We haven't seen anything like this since the 60s, when the southern states were resisting the 50s and 60s, were the federal government's directions with regard to Civil Rights Act, or back to the 1860s, when we had the same thing, of course, which led to a civil war, or the 1830s, when South Carolina stood up to Andrew Jackson, or the Whiskey Rebellion that George Washington had put down, and when people in Pennsylvania refused to work with the federal government. So, I mean, look, this is kind of crazy, and Pritzker's amping this thing up for his own purposes in a way that's going to get dangerous.
Is the supremacy clause in play? I mean, is this even constitutional? Can Brandon Johnson even do what he did today? I mean, is it or is this just all kind of political theater that is blatantly unconstitutional?
Look, it's all theater. It is all theater. As a practical matter, in order to make an order that someone can't be trespassing, you've got to be able to back it up with the power to arrest the person and remove them if they're trespassing. And think about that. What does that mean? Are they going to have the Chicago police, if ICE is gathering together a SWAT team a SWAT team to go hit another building where it's been taken over by a Latin American gang, a drug cartel? Are they going to have the CPD surround them with their own SWAT team and then try to arrest them? This is nuts. The idea that you have elected officials who are sworn to uphold the Constitution, trying to do things to obstruct the federal government's enforcement of valid federal laws is like a step too far. I mean, they really are taking the whole sanctuary city thing to an extreme, which is highlighting really the unconstitutional illegality of the whole idea.
They made up these signs too, because I think if you have a private parking lot and you want to be covered by this, they have these really cool looking, they're official looking signs. I'll give them that much, which I guess you can put up and say, that ICE can't use your parking lot either. I mean, can they do that?
Yeah, I think that's different. I mean, I think, under the Constitution, the federal government is entitled to take over private property. And the city of Chicago does have the same rights as a private citizen, but there's a practical limitation on that, which is what are you going to do about it? Now, a private landowner whose property is taken has a takings lawsuit against the government for the invasion of their property. If someone comes in, you can have a civil rights action against them for what they did. But you're not going to have the Chicago police come and arrest federal agents. That just isn't happening.
Carl Cannon, Richard mentioned the 1960s, 1860s. You're a student of history. Is this insurrection-y? What's going on here? Is this like, bordering on hot civil war or what?
Well, I'll use a phrase Democrats like to use. This is settled law. The federal government has primacy. But Richard said something that I've been thinking about, which is these sanctuary cities. I think the first one was Berkeley, California. And pretty soon, there's a couple of hundred of them, and then there's sanctuary states. What happened in that case, the rationale in California, which was the vanguard of this, was that they didn't want local police officers serving as immigration officers. And the rationale behind it long before Donald Trump's on the scene, this had nothing to do with him, was that in these communities, the police had forged delicate relationships with, let's say the Mexican American community in Los Angeles, because that's originally what we're talking about. And they want people to be able to report crime without fear of being deported. There was a whole rationale for it, and it was a balancing act. And when asked about it, you can't violate federal law. They'd say, no, we're prioritizing our local resources. What we're saying is we've decided not to use city resources to do this function. But it turned out to be a slippery slope. Now, fast forward 25 years later, Pritzker and Brandon Johnson, they're like, George Wallace in the Schoolhouse Door. They're like this, they would not get this. They would be baffled by this, but they're the Southern segregationists. They're basically saying federal law doesn't apply to us. And we're going way beyond any idea of sanctuary city with, trying to look out for the Mexican American community and protect victims of crime. We're just thumbing our nose at federal law because we don't like who the president is, and we have different ideas about immigration. But telling federal agents that they can't use city property, I think that's problematic. Richard can correct me. I don't think that's a lawful order. I think federal government needs to use government property. They say, here's an emergency situation. We're going to use it for this time. And putting yourself in opposition to the federal government. But Richard's right. That we've seen that before.
Okay, but Richard, back to you. Like, let's say you are Pritzker or you are Brandon Johnson. You're a progressive Democrat. Like, what are you supposed to do? You're supposed to just lay down and let the, cooperate. You're supposed to. I mean, they would obviously that would infuriate their base. I mean, how should they handle this politically?
Well, I know, but that's the problem, which is I think people have lost sight of the fact that we're a union. We're the United States of America. And when there's a Republican president, he's president of the entire territory that is comprised of the United States of America. He's not just president of the red states, and the blue states get to say, you're not welcome here. And we had Pritzker on a press conference this afternoon saying ICE is not welcome here. Well, yeah, they are. I mean, that's part of the United States. And that's why I think they've sort of gone a bridge too far. It's one thing.
Wait, Richard, let me ask you something about that.
Yeah.
So Florida doesn't have a state income tax. What if the state of Florida said, the Internal Revenue Service is not welcome in Florida. We don't like we're paying too much taxes. They have to get out of Florida. Everybody would see how absurd that is, right?
Right.
Is this
Right.
any different?
No. And the reality is the federal government always has its priorities, and they use various levers to try to get the states to work with them. It's Democratic presidents, Republican presidents. For as long as the Republic has existed, once we've had a unitary executive, we had one president for the entire United States, whatever number of states it was at that time. And now we have 50 states. And the idea that Illinois is exempt because, gosh, we don't like the immigration policy of the duly elected president by a majority of citizens and by a supermajority of electoral votes, that somehow Illinois gets to say, yeah, we're not going to let you enforce law here. We're not going to do that.
Well,
And what's nutty about this is if they did cooperate, there'd be a lot less conflict. So what you have is a situation where, the local officials, J.B. Pritzker wants to be the leader of the extreme wing of the Democratic Party, which is sort of what drives the primary process for president. And so he is looking for this conflict. He's trying to go like one step short of insurrection. He started his press conference by saying there is no insurrection. And then he went on to talk about all the ways that ICE isn't welcome and you can't enforce federal law here and blah, blah, blah. So you're sort of like, dude, I mean, how does this all add up?
yeah, but Richard, just to devil's advocate for a second here, when I hear you, like where it's a union and all that stuff, and that's great. But when the president gets in front of the generals last week and says, we should use some of these dangerous cities as training grounds for our military, National Guard, but military, because we're going to Chicago very soon. That sounds to me like the president's using rhetoric that sounds like he's invading a foreign country. That can't be
No.
helpful.
Donald Trump has always had this kind of aggressive rhetoric. That's sort of who he is. It stirs up the other side. And I think JB wants to establish that he will just come as hard as Trump does. And so that's what's kind of creating this situation. I mean, the reality is going hard after criminals is not a bad thing. Let's look at the example in Washington, D.C. It's not like there are a loss of freedoms in Washington, D.C. D.C. is not an authoritarian location within the United States. What you have is a lot less crime in Washington, D.C. now than you did 3 months ago, because they've done a surge, not just of the National Guard, but off of FBI and DEA. If the local officials would work with the federal government, we would have less crime in Chicago. There would be fewer murders, fewer carjackings. The evidence is in. It's happening in Memphis with cooperation with a Republican governor. In Portland and in Chicago, because they have local Democrats, they're refusing to do anything with the federal government, which is just kind of crazy.
Well,
Why
Richard,
isn't having less crime a good thing in Chicago? It's not
there's
going to
a
be authoritarian state.
Democratic mayor here in Washington, and Washington's an even more Democratic city than Chicago. And Muriel Bowser, she decided to, cooperate, not because she necessarily approved of what the president was doing, but for the reasons you said. She tried to make the best of a situation that she didn't think was ideal. She didn't badmouth Trump. My guess is, got the federal government to say privately, we will be going after criminals, not just illegals. And to your point, it worked in Washington partly because the local Democrats decided to not just dig in and stand as the resistance.
We're talking about crime here. We're talking about immigration enforcement. It seems problematic to me the degree to which we allied those two topics together. Because if you look at what happened in Washington, I think about 40% of the arrests have been immigration arrests. If you look at when they're talking about Portland, they're really talking about trying to defend these ICE facilities from Antifa or protesters, depending on mostly peaceful.
Mostly
peaceful
arsonists.
Yeah, arsonists. But you get my
Exactly.
point. My point is that, I mean, and Tom, I'd like your view on this too. Like politically, I think when you talk to people about crime, you get one reaction. When you talk to them about enforcing immigration law, you get sort of a different reaction, don't you?
What I would say is, look, I think it's really kind of the same thing, because a lot of the people that they're picking up, not everybody, but a large, focus is on the criminal element within the illegal alien community. So, there was this very highly publicized raid on a building that Trende Agra had taken over, and they arrested, I don't know, it was a dozen people or something in there that were known gang members, and some of them were wanted for crimes. So, they talk about this as being, oh, they used a Black Hawk helicopter and these other things. Well, guess what? When the CPD gets serious about stuff, they have a SWAT team and they look like the same guys. It's the same technique. It's not like it's any different. And so when you're arresting, cartel members in Chicago, you're also reducing crime. Now, there's also an opportunity in all the other neighborhoods of Chicago that are not perhaps, the hotbed for the criminal illegal aliens. There's an opportunity to reduce crime there as well. It's what happened in DC, and it's what's happening in Memphis right now. And why not use the federal resources to reduce murders? Doesn't every life count? Why is it that we just let 55 shootings over the course of a weekend in the south and west sides of Chicago go by as if that's okay? Why don't we get that down to 15 or 10 or maybe even 0, heaven forbid? That's a lot of lives saved, and we can do it by working together. The truth is, Chicago worked with Obama when he was in office to do this sort of thing. Obama had more deportations than Trump did. And so this is not like this is some terrible new thing. It's just that it happens to be Trump, and the political necessity for Pritzker of trying to establish himself as a vanguard for the kind of hard left wing of the Democratic Party is what's creating this crisis.